You know when you open an academic journal, or some of you will know anyway, that what you get full-length papers, which are sort of 8,000 words or something like that, and then just occasionally you get something called a research note, which squeezes in there. It's a couple of pages long, and actually it's just sort of a little something that someone had thought that they'd like to try and get an audience for, and it's nothing particularly substantive. Well, I kind of feel a bit like what I wrote for today was a bit like that research note, and I was going to sort of squeeze it in somewhere, so you mightn't notice too much what it was. So, and I wanted to address a particular issue which I think is a concern in terms of how sociologists actually become activists. As I've got a bit longer, and in the light of what happened this morning, and in light of the comment that I made towards the end of the morning session, I'd like to sort of try to now turn this into a slightly bigger thing somehow. Sort of use a couple more minutes to do that, and that's really to say or to reflect that although there's 70 people here or whatever, and clearly there are a lot of sociologists or people who regard themselves as sociologists who want to be engaged with issues, who want to bring activism into their sociology. But there's actually a problem, that it's not something which is necessarily straightforward, and there are various issues, and during today we're going to raise some of those issues, and we're also going to try to come up with some solutions to some of those issues. And what I'm going to do, therefore, is just talk about one small little issue. But I suppose that, what I want to reflect on before I get started on that really is to say, well, maybe there's a conflict here, that despite what John said at the beginning of the day today, that we want to embrace the idea of public sociology, of sociologists as engaged, there's also the problem that within an institution such as a university, which has become, as John was pointing out, imbued with the neoliberal ideology which is suffusing society and has been doing so for the last 30, 40, perhaps longer years, that there is actually a problem of being a sociologist and an activist, and that we can't actually say, well, this is something which is just straightforward that we're going to do, that what we can do is we can actually find a way forward on that. When I stood up this morning, I said that I'm actually coordinator of the Sociologists Outside Academia group in the BSA, and even though I've also got a connection with the University of Sheffield as now a non-salaried honorary member of staff. But the thing is that sociologists are everywhere, and every year thousands more sociologists are produced by our institutions of higher learning. And there are lots of people out there who are actually thinking of themselves as sociologists. On the Sociology Outside Academia group, we've got 500 members, not necessarily all active, but that's 500 people who have actually identified themselves as being sociologists. And in many ways, those people are, some of them at least, perhaps only a very, very small proportion, are people who are very much engaging with the issues which they are working in their jobs, in the public sector, in social enterprise, some in business, and some people as independent researchers. I was speaking to one such person over lunch. And for them, actually, there's not that conflict necessarily, because actually the job and their life and what they do are all part of the same thing. But for academia, actually, it's harder than that, because there are different registers which are going on, and if you're in academic life and you're thinking to get up through the ranks of it, then you have to play a number of games which don't necessarily marry with what the people here today, that what we are interested in is actually trying to make a difference in the world. People don't care necessarily about what you actually do with your research once you've actually published it in the Journal of Sociology or the British Journal of Sociology. That's it. Is it not the case that in fact we should be publishing books? And we shouldn't be publishing necessarily just books which are going to have an academic audience, but books that are going to have a broader audience. Actually, the academic journal paper is the worst, least inclusive place in which we should actually be publishing our research. So that's kind of my rant then. And with that in mind, I hope you'll allow me to do my little research note. I've actually produced some handouts. I thought I'd be talking to 20 people, so I've produced 20 copies. So I'm not going to give them out in advance. I'll leave them at the back for anyone who's interested in it once I've finished talking about it. Because you may actually say, well, look, I'm not too bothered about that actually, so that would just be a waste of a piece of paper. But if you are interested, there'll be some copies for you to take away. So what I want to do then, in the few minutes remaining, is just, I've got 5 more slides, and what I want to do is I want to present to you one of the things which I think gets in the way of sociologists being activists or activists being sociologists. And it's not just, given also allowing for our title for this panel of interdisciplinarity, I can't say that word, it's not just sociology, it's also psychology. I'll make reference in a moment to critical psychology, and it's to other disciplines as well in the social sciences who all have this issue. So, this then, we finally get round to what I wanted to talk about here, which is about how sociologists and how activists think about identity, and whether sometimes there's conflict here. And what I'm going to suggest that really one of the issues that underpins some, though not all, activist work is identity politics, and that collective action is often orientated around some sort of politics of identity. And the examples that I've given here are clearly the feminist struggles, the queer struggles which have been going on for the last half of a century, struggles from trade union movements forward, and then of course all the struggles by marginal or oppressed or victimised groups, and just given as two quite different examples of refugee groups or asylum seekers on one hand. On the other hand, groups that I've been involved with in my academic work, patient groups. I was researching on different patient groups and how they actually develop their campaigns and the alliances that they make around disease categories, and people quite clearly identifying themselves in terms of a disease category which has been imposed upon them by biomedicine. And given that, a lot of sociologists actually have quite a lot of problem with that idea, because what they would actually say is that this kind of ascription of something which is a fixed body attribute, whether that's your gender or your sexuality or your age or the disease that you are experiencing, if it's a social role which has been ascribed to you, or if it's an identity such as being a disabled person, all of those things might actually, by a lot of sociologists, be regarded as essentialist and problematic. And the last 40 years, probably, social constructionism has actually emerged as a major challenge to that kind of essentialist thinking within sociology. So that leaves us with a conflict. And let me give you an example to bring this to light. And I just plucked this one off change.org. And just at random, I could have chosen anything. It's a campaign which has been going on to persuade Facebook that they shouldn't actually censor images which were put up by campaigners are showing women post-mastectomy as a way to challenge stereotypes about the way in which the female body should be, and actually trying, as part of a campaign, to try to destigmatise the effects of people who have some sort of clinical procedure as a consequence of a breast cancer. And the realist identity politics behind this campaign seems to me that really what we should be saying is that Facebook shouldn't censor these images, which they're doing, not because they're unacceptable, just because they've got a ban on naked breasts. That's the reason they censored it. And what the campaign is saying, that actually breast cancer survivors are fighting this disease and the isolation which is caused by that, and therefore Facebook should actually allow these images up, and they should break their censorship on that. So that's the argument. Now, what a constructionist sociologist or psychologist might say is, well, this concept of cancer survivor is actually rather problematic. We can't actually hang on to that, because when we unpack it, we realise that it's actually a product of various discourses, predominantly emanating from biomedicine. And if that's the case, then actually having that label of cancer survivor is actually itself is a disempowerment, and it cannot actually be a way to empower. And you can regard that, I mean, this is the same argument which has gone on within feminism, for example, within queer studies, actually debating upon the labels which are attached to people, and are questioning whether this essentialising of certain categories is actually problematic. So that would be the perspective. I mean, I recently did a review of critical psychology perspectives on sexuality, and affirmative gay psychology has developed a sort of very productive campaign around challenging heteronormativity, challenging patriarchy and such like. But actually, from a constructionist point of view, from a radical psychology point of view, there's quite a problem, because that view would actually be seen to be... Am I running out of time? Okay. That would actually be regarded as a problematic position. So if that's the case, then for a sociologist, it may actually be, if you take that perspective, a constructionist perspective, it may actually be a problem as a basis for collective action. So what I'm going to do then, in just the last two slides that I've got here, is just to suggest a way around this. And it's a practical suggestion, which is that we can actually start to break through this particular little challenge. And I've been working recently with the work of the philosopher Rosie Braidotti and the social philosopher Manuel de Landa, and they are arguing for what they call new materialism. And what this is about a way of focusing on the materiality of the world and the interactions that go on between bodies and the forces, the physical reality of the environment and such like. And what their view is that we take these things, we don't assume that they're prior, but they exist in relationship to each other. And what neo-materialism does is actually to explore the power, how power produces these apparent entities, such that we think about woman or heterosexual or child or cancer survivor or whatever. And the task actually is to resist that power process which actually produces those entities. So it's a bit like the constructionist analysis, but what it doesn't do is it just doesn't limit everything to say all we can talk about is just the discursive production of these different categories. What it does, taking the example that I talked about earlier, the example of challenging the Facebook censorship of post-mastectomy, is to actually look at the broader web of forces which are going on in that situation. And that includes Facebook's reaction. It reflects its rules on images, but it also reflects the biological and social forces that have actually produced patients, and the idea of a patient. It's produced ideas of bodies in a particular way, ideas of beauty and such like. And what we need to do is to actually challenge Facebook, but actually challenge Facebook as part of the problem, if you like. That what their ban is doing is actually is part of that network of interactions that is going on. And what the challenge to Facebook is actually doing is to open up new possibilities for people, whether they are, quotes, cancer survivors or non-cancer survivors. Actually possibilities for all of us to actually break through some of those constraints which have been produced and are reflected in things like the censorship. So my last slide then is really to say, and in the context of what I said earlier, this is to give you one tool as a way forward to actually argue through with your constructionist colleagues in your departments of sociology or wherever, to actually say, look, we can actually start to engage around identity politics, but in a new way. We focus on the flux and the becoming other rather than the stability of entities. We look not at what bodies or people or collectivities are, but what they can do. And what we do as activists, we challenge the limits imposed upon bodies, and we open up new capacities for what bodies can do. And just leave you with that quotation, which, actually I think is a pretty dramatic thing, because it's actually setting out a new ontology, which is neo-materialism provides a basis for understanding identities that is neither realist nor constructionist. So my final sentence is, there are conflicts. It's not straightforward being a sociologist and being an activist. What we need to do in this group is actually look for solutions which can actually address some of those problems.